Hello and welcome to week 3. This week we'll continue our discussion of planning business research, and we will ultimately wind up with a research plan that you will use to complete the term research project and report. So this week we're going to start jumping around a bit. I've taken the liberty of kind of reorganizing the textbook in the way that I feel like will flow best. So we are going to start with Chapter 8, having to do with secondary data. And the reason secondary data is here is because oftentimes that is where researchers will turn first to see if those research questions you've come up with can be answered easily with secondary data. So we're going to talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of secondary data. We're going to talk about different types of data analysis using secondary data, and we're going to talk about some sources of secondary data. One of the primary sources these days, and again, I've mentioned the idea of big data, that those are typically internal databases, secondary data that already exists but were not collected specifically for a research project. So things like scanner data from a retailer like Kroger, their transactions, their customer transactions, go into a huge database that can then be mined for statistical patterns and regularities that can be the basis of generating business intelligence. So we'll talk about internal sources as well as some external sources of secondary data. Next, we're going to turn to a very important topic in research, which is sampling. So we're going to spend 2 chapters talking about sampling. Who knew it was so important? But it is, in order for a research plan to achieve its goals and to answer the questions effectively, we have to think very thoroughly about the sample that we're going to use to collect data in order to answer our question. So we're going to talk about why we do sample instead of trying to collect data from every single unit that we could, which if we conduct research in that way, that's called a census. We're going to talk about the process of identifying a target population and selecting a sampling frame. We're going to talk about sampling and non-sampling errors, and we're going to talk about the different types of sampling, probability and non-probability, and some types of both of those, and we're going to talk about their advantages and disadvantages. Then finally, Chapter 7 is going to have a little bit of statistics in it. This isn't a statistics class. We're hoping that you have had a statistics class in your past. So this isn't going to be advanced statistics in any way. You will very likely find the information contained in this chapter to be review, stuff that you've learned about before. So what we're going to talk about in Chapter 17 are frequency distributions and measures of central tendency, like mean and standard deviation, normal distributions, etc., etc. We're going to talk about the central limit theorem. That's very important in terms of the sample size required to answer our questions. We're going to talk about confidence intervals, and then cap that off by talking about the important issues that we need to consider when we're trying to decide how many people, how many respondents do I need to have to this survey? How many days do I have to test this new menu item in the field? What are some considerations around sample size that we need to keep in mind? Fairly typical again, your reading quiz on day 4 kicks things off, and as always, discussion forum posts on day 5 and 7, case analysis day 6, and your weekly research deliverable this week is an actual research plan. So by now you should see how things are really kind of building on themselves. You came up with questions and objectives last week. Now you're going to write a plan to answer those questions and to meet those objectives. Now, I'll remind you again, I want you to do your best work on these research deliverables. I'm not going to be grading them very harshly, but what I am going to be doing is giving you feedback, and that is really invaluable because, again, what my intention is for these weekly deliverables to almost naturally result in you having a finished research project by the end of the course. That's a much better way of doing it than getting to week 6 or week 7 and saying, oh my goodness, I have to come up with an entire research project to do this week. Oh, and by the way, I have my family responsibilities and my work responsibilities, and when is that ever going to get done? So continue to put forth a good effort on those weekly deliverables, and you will be thankful at the end of the semester that you have. All right, well, that's all for this brief introduction. I look forward to seeing you in our virtual classroom.